Welcome to the CEC Report. It's the 30th of August. I'm Robert Barwick and I'm with CEC leader Craig Isherwood. Welcome, Craig.
Yeah, thanks, Robbie.
In this week's CEC Report, Syria is a British setup and Rudd is a British tool. Trans-Pacific Partnership will chain nations to European Union-style dictatorship. And finally, don't just vote for the CEC, fight for the future. So first, Syria is a British setup and Rudd is a British tool. Craig, this is the overwhelming issue of the day, the Syria emergency, which is an entirely Western fabricated emergency. Now, we've got breaking news just before we came to air. So this is Friday the 30th of August. The UK Parliament overnight voted against military action. Now, it was a narrow margin of 13 votes. Apparently, Craig, it was a non-binding vote.
That would be right. Yes.
However, because they've done it, Cameron and the British who have ran this, up till now, it's the British who've run this show. They've pulled the strings. They've been the most keen to get in there and intervene in Syria.
We're not talking about the British people, Robbie, because this vote shows actually
that's right.
The British people don't want it. The British people are a bit like Australians, you know. What we have is this succubus that we talk about being the British. We mean the British oligarchy, the financial City of London nexus.
Yeah, there's plenty of people in Britain who don't want to be cannon fodder either.
That's right, and particularly the troops on the ground.
But what the British ruling elite represent, of course, is the empire and the imperial mentality, right?
The continuation of this centuries-old British empire that used to be represented by redcoats and gunboats and diplomacies around the world in that sort of form. It's just transformed itself into a financial empire now out of the City of London.
But it's the British who have always despised the sovereignty of nation states. That nations should be able to make their own decisions because they're a colonial imperial mentality and they like to be able to just go and run countries the way they like, whether it's through financial means now or through the gunboats, as you said. So we've now got, here's what's interesting though, Cameron has had to acknowledge that this vote means the British people don't want military action. It's being reported that his hands are now tied because it would be a rather extreme act to ignore this vote of Parliament, even if it is non-binding. So the Brits might not go ahead with it. And the markets rallied overnight on the assumption that an attack wouldn't go ahead, which is interesting. The problem is the Brits, thanks to all their legwork, have thoroughly whipped the Americans up.
You mean Obama?
Obama, the White House, not the military, and the Pentagon is totally opposed to this, etc. Because they're looking at what happens next and what happens next, right? But the White House is totally whipped up, so it might still go ahead. It must be stopped. Lyndon LaRouche, the American statesman, has just issued a statement, and to praise it down to one argument, this is what LaRouche is saying: the danger of a nuclear war spiraling out of this is so great, it supersedes all other considerations. And he makes the point, quote, once the fuse is lit with even a limited military strike against Syria, the situation immediately moves out of control. And we've just put out LaRouche's statement as a release.
And that will happen quite easily, Robbie. Look, you've got allies with Syria like Iran. What does that mean for Iran if the US unilaterally goes in? Even with the so-called support of the 35 nations of the willing, it's the US that's being deployed with its military might to go in and smash Syria. What does that mean for Iran? What does it mean for Lebanon? What does it mean for Israel? What does it mean for Australia, supporting actually what would be a murderous war? Look, this is pure, if it goes ahead, it's pure, not even legalised murder because they're intending to override the United Nations.
Well, here's the thing. It's obviously a mess there. People saw what they saw on TV. We cannot sit here, Craig, and prove or disprove the evidence. What we can do, though, is remind people that the people telling us this evidence have no credibility whatsoever. They are liars. Now, I saw a media report yesterday making this statement, Craig, that people like Rudd in Australia and Obama, they opposed the Iraq War in 2003. Now they're in government, not in opposition. They see it differently. Well, no, they did not oppose the Iraq War. That is a lie. First, Obama, he wasn't in Congress in 2003. So he didn't get to vote. His Secretary of State, though, John Kerry, was in the Congress in 2003, and despite by that time, all the weapons inspectors, etc., had been screaming for ages. There is no evidence of this. There's no evidence of weapons of mass destruction, but still, John Kerry in the US Senate voted for the illegal invasion of Iraq. And that was in 2003. In 2004, after it all blown up, gone bad, etc., and he ran against Bush for president in 2004, the reason he didn't win, the reason that man was defeated by the dumbest president in US history, is because that vote of his, when he tried to campaign against the Iraq war, because he'd voted for it, it destroyed his credibility and it destroyed his chances, right? And it was for those of us who were hoping Bush would be toppled, the worst thing was to have Kerry running against him. So that's the Americans. They've got no credibility. So Kerry's up there saying 2 days ago, anyone who questions the evidence on this has no moral compass. Well, John Kerry, you have no moral compass. And as for Kevin Rudd, John Howard led the fight for us to support the Americans with a ring through our nose. But of course, it's not the Americans, it's the Anglo-Americans. All the key lies came out of England. Go back and look at Bush's speeches to the Congress. The British have told us this, the British have told us that, the British have told us that Saddam can strike in 45 minutes, the British have told us that Saddam is
That was Tony Blair, to be precise.
Tony Blair,
right?
so as if that gave the evidence credibility, right? People have got to remember these things. It's not the Americans, it's the British who do the setup. The British brain...
And this is always done, Robin, and you heard it again this week in the Parliament, people were listening. We have a responsibility to protect. We have a responsibility to protect the rights of people.
The Tony Blair doctrine.
This is the doctrine of responsibility to protect, and it is a doctrine that's being used to override the sovereignty of nation states.
So Kevin Rudd was in the Labor Party, and he was the foreign spokesman for the Labor Party. And we were trying to stop this war in Australia, Craig, and we were coming up, the Labor Party kept saying to us right to the very end, we don't have a position on it yet. Because Rudd is a member of the Australian-American dialogue, and the truth is that when the Labor Party took a vote in caucus, the caucus voted no. So Labor voted no in the Parliament, but they didn't have the numbers, so the vote was yes ultimately. The caucus voted no, but Kevin Rudd was part of a faction of neoconservatives in the caucus, including Kim Beazley, including Michael Danby, one of the most rabid neoconservatives in Australian Parliament, a Cheney-type neoconservative whose latest thing is let's bomb China, right? Kevin Rudd and those two guys and a few others voted yes. They fought like tooth and nail to get Labor Party to go with the war. So after it blew up in Australia, Kevin Rudd, of course, is parading around saying, oh yeah, no, Labor opposed the war. But anyone who followed it know that he supported it, right? So this guy has no credibility whatsoever. We have to focus on another aspect of Rudd, though, Craig, which is quite important. Because Kevin Rudd, and we've documented this, and you can see our releases about it and the information on our website, as far as can be stated, that's possible to assert, Prime Minister Kevin Rudd is an agent, an intelligence agent of the Australian Secret Intelligence Service, which is a branch of MI6. Now, all agents of ASIS are secret, right, and can never have their identities revealed. So you'll never find that on a list somewhere. But as far as it can be established, it has to be. Why? Rudd started off as a civil servant in DFAT, the Department of Foreign Affairs. Department of Foreign Affairs houses ASIS.
This was after he was at ANU studying Chinese.
That's right.
It's really quite something.
Working with anti-Chinese agitators. So he's in DFAT. He's working as a diplomat. He becomes a diplomat. Well, all ASIS agents are diplomats. That's their cover, right? And ASIS, how's this? The people who've written the history of Australia's intelligence agencies make the point that ASIS is a branch of MI6. The ASIS agents call London MI6 head office, and they call Melbourne main office, right? The proof, though, that Rudd had to have been involved in ASIS is when he left the Department of Foreign Affairs, not so much left, in 1988 he applied for a job. And the job he applied for is one of the top intelligence postings in Australia, where it was to be the liaison between the Office of National Assessments, which is the peak intelligence body in Australia that oversees all intelligence gathering, and British intelligence and it was a London job. So his job was to represent our peak intelligence body at the weekly meetings of the British Intelligence Sharing Committee, and it's a position, Craig, that not even America has. Right? Americans are not invited into this. Only Australia has this position. Rudd applied for and got that job. Well, he wouldn't have had that job if he wasn't in intelligence in DFAT. And if he's in intelligence in DFAT, he's an ASIS agent, right? As it happens, he didn't take up that job, even though he won it, because he moved to Queensland instead to start his political career, right? And that's why he's in Parliament today and is the Prime Minister of Australia today. But in other words, he is tightly tied in to the MI6 British intelligence apparatus, which is the source of all the cooked up lies about Iraq in 2003 and about Syria today, right? People have to know that because they're not giving us any evidence on TV. They don't have any evidence. They're relying on us to swallow their credibility, and they don't have any. So we've put out releases on this. Go and look at it. Craig, in the time we've got left, though, I've got a question for you that people also have to understand. There's a timing issue here. Because until a week and a half ago, Syria was hardly on the radar. All of a sudden, it blew up, supposedly around this footage, which hasn't been confirmed. But what is the real issue with the timing of this?
Robbie, we've talked about on the show a lot about the nature of the financial disintegration. That's what the issue is. But more specifically, if you go and have a look in the United States, there is enormous support now for the Glass-Steagall separation of banks. And this is a policy that's been promoted by Lyndon LaRouche. It comes out of Franklin D. Roosevelt in 1933, whereby you deal with the bankrupt banking system by quarantining the unpayable speculative debt. Now, 25 US states have introduced legislation into their parliaments to
calling
pass.
On the Congress to pass it.
Yeah, 4 have already done so, right? You have 75 congressional members that have supported the call for Glass-Steagall. So this has got a lot of legs. It's got a lot of support within the political and the economic and the banking, not so much the banking fraternity, but definitely within the population of the United States. It's so much support, in fact, that JP Morgan themselves have come out by name, which they never have done in the past, to attack Glass-Steagall when these resolutions get put forward.
So they're really afraid. They're really afraid this could break through and pass.
And this is not just the United States. In Britain, the members of Parliament there have come out calling for Glass-Steagall. High-ranking economists, establishment economists even have come out calling for Glass-Steagall because they know their system is coming down. We know from discussions that we've had internationally with people that there is going to be a global financial crisis Mark II. You can't keep pumping trillions upon trillions upon trillions of dollars into the banking system without the thing collapsing.
And people fear that could erupt within weeks.
So what you do is you've got to create a global dictatorship. The way you do that, they think, is by going to war. What we are saying is, what LaRouche is saying, is that any idea of war these days immediately escalates to thermonuclear war, and that will be the end of civilization as we know it. There is no such thing as a half step towards nuclear war.
And aren't they afraid, though, Craig, that because our counter to them is Glass-Steagall, that if it passes, it destroys them?
That's their power base. Wall Street, City of London, they're gone. You go back to the idea of national banking, of the support of sovereign governments. So that's what we represent, it's what we've been campaigning on in this election. And Robbie, that's what's getting legs here globally.
So this Syria thing is like the murderous act of a cornered tiger.
It's a fear reaction about what's possible and what's about to, what's coming down.
All right, which is why we have to stop it at all costs. So, watch this space. By the time people watch this, Craig, there will have been all manner of developments. But remember this material, and we'll keep you posted. When we come back, we're going to talk about the Trans-Pacific Partnership. Welcome back to the CEC Report. Trans-Pacific Partnership will chain nations to an EU-style dictatorship. There are people who know about this. There are plenty who don't. Australia, Craig, is one of 11 nations around the Pacific, excluding China, interestingly, but there are people who are saying they should be brought in. They're negotiating a treaty called the Trans-Pacific Partnership, right, which is TPP, it's known as. Now, what this would do is turn the Pacific into like a European community.
European
right?
Union,
A European Union style arrangement. Well, look how well that's worked for them. what happens is nations lose their sovereignty. And in this particular case, with what's being negotiated here with the TPP, this is a parallel to bail-in and those other things we're warning about, where what they're creating is a corporate banker dictatorship over nations. And of course, by our traitorous governments negotiating these treaties and signing us onto them, it becomes a form of law higher than other laws in Australia, right?
Yeah, basically this entity would cede sovereignty to a supranational, unaccountable body, just like it's happening in the European Union, where you have a European Parliament, which basically creates laws, and then all the countries, the countries below it, Germany, France, and so forth, then have to just basically pass enabling legislation because they're dictated to that they have to do that. So Australia would be taking its lead from a non-elected supranational government, or not even government, entity.
Well, let's look at some of the content, which is just stunning. There's an American blogger named Jim Hightower who has gotten access to highly secret information about the TPP. He's written a piece on the internet called "The TPP is not about free trade, it's a corporate coup d'etat against us." That's his point. And us meaning America as well. A lot of people would say this is American imperialism. No, Wall Street is not America, right? City of London is not England. That's the point. This is a banker slime mold, LaRouche used to call it, that sits above the whole operation. He makes the point, Hightower, that if this passes, one of the things it will specifically do is forbid a Glass-Steagall style separation of banking. Quote, "The deal explicitly prohibits transaction taxes. It restricts firewall reforms that separate consumer banking from risky investment banking, thus prohibiting Congress from reinstating the much-needed Glass-Steagall firewall in our country. These extreme provisions would be enforceable by the banks themselves. TPP empowers the banks to force governments either to repeal or reform laws or to compensate banks with taxpayer money for losses that they say are caused by reforms."
Right. What's not talked about here, Robbie, obviously this would include bail-in, the idea that banks can happily steal their depositors' money.
They would. It gets worse. A corporation under TPP could skirt a nation's laws and demand compensation at an international tribunal for any government policy or action that undermined its expected profits. And the example he gives is such as a hike in the minimum wage. Right? If America has a terrible minimum wage, if they raised it by $1, corporations could sue the government saying, we want that money paid to us that you've taken away from our profits. Big pharmacy companies can outlaw the production of generic drugs and the use of generic drugs. Now, the way generic drugs work is when they make their drugs really expensive, but when there's an expiry date on the patent. When that expires, they can be, if they're good drugs, a lot of people want to produce them, right? And they're much, much cheaper. So that can be outlawed under this. That will kill thousands of people quickly. And then there's no legal redress, so that if these corporations get out of control, the governments do not. Basically, the governments have to suck it up. This is already written in there, because what is sacrosanct is the market and their profits and the financial system, rather than the authority of governments. So, Craig, more and more though, like we've said with bail-in, we are seeing moves towards this model where corporate governments is outside and above the authority of actual democratically elected governments. And isn't the only word for that fascism?
Robbie, we've talked many times about population reduction on this show, and people sort of think, oh, it can't be right. I mean, the Queen of England and Prince Philip talk about reducing the world's population from 7 billion down to 1 billion. How could that possibly be? What you've just outlined, look at the big pharma shutdown, or the removal of the ability to produce generic drugs. Millions of people are going to be affected by that.
Yep.
This is the style of governance that we are witnessing coming in around the world under the auspices of globalisation, which is top-down corporate control of the very daily lives of individuals. That's fascism.
And take away from governments any authority to intervene,
any sovereignty
for their people
whatsoever. And they don't care if they kill, through this mechanism, billions of people, because that is in fact the intent of this legislation, and people need to really understand that this is not some accident, this is not corporate greed, this is a political program for population reduction at the highest levels.
Yeah, because they maintain their power. Okay, we've had to keep that short. When we come back, we're going to talk about the election. Welcome back to the CEC Report. Finally, don't just vote for the CEC, fight for the future. Now, a whole bunch of you will be watching this on Sunday night on Channel 31 after the election has been decided. A whole bunch of you will be watching this before the election has been decided. Some of you will be watching it next week. Doesn't matter. The election, in a sense, doesn't matter. We're probably going to have an Abbott government. The CEC has, no preference one way or the other, frankly. The issue is not that, Craig. We need to talk to the people of Australia about, do you wait for elections to actually act? And with everything that we have, the CEC has contested this election, but before the election, during the election and after the election, we're in hand-to-hand combat to fight against the policies that are destroying Australia and for the solutions of Glass-Steagall, a national bank, and big infrastructure. What I wanted to ask you about, for the sake of the viewers, the fight we're on now against bail-in, isn't it possible that if we can defeat this in Australia, that opens the door for us to win the other fights for things like Glass-Steagall and the other policies in between elections?
Yeah, Robbie, I think that just coming back to an earlier point, there's always hype around elections, right? People take what horse am I going to bet on? And there's always a sense of, is my football team going to win?
Yeah.
Right. The reality is that people have to understand we get the sort of government that we deserve. So if we are voting for the Abbott government, we are going to get a government that we deserve. That's going to be an austerity-based government. It's going to be a government that pushes bail-in. Now, we uniquely have caught this bail-in issue before the legislation has come into Parliament. Yep. We know it's being produced. We know where it's being produced. We know why it's being produced, and we've got all the goods on our website and our last newspaper, last New Citizen newspaper, about why it's going to become policy. The question is for the people out there, are you going to mobilise in order to stop this? If you don't, well, you can kiss your deposits goodbye in the banks. You can kiss the Australian economy goodbye, because the global financial crisis Mark II is coming. This debt that's out there, the speculative debt in this speculative banking system, is unpayable. The elites know this. So they are banking on the fact that there is these new laws coming in that they can literally steal your deposits.
So by fight, though, Craig, you mean more than vote, right?
Oh, look, that's not even a percentage of the sort of effort that we need. People, time and time again, if they spend as much energy that they spend complaining about their government, actually doing something about it by joining us, then we would take over this country. You wouldn't have these sorts of policies. But the cultural problem we have to get through, Robbie, here in this country, just talk about politics or religion at the kitchen table amongst family members is almost a complete verboten, right? It's just not allowed. Well, that's the cultural problem we have. And that's, as I was talking to someone the other day, that's a problem from our convict heritage. If you start to criticise Mum, right, the Queen, or the British Crown, you're going to get into trouble. Well, guess what? You're already in trouble. And you better start working out that you're going to fight against this. Otherwise, you can kiss the entire shebang goodbye.
And one thing people have to understand, there's a reason we're not covered in the media by and large, but I mean, hardly at all. They'll see wall-to-wall Qatar and Palmer and One Nation and whatever, but not the CEC, because we have the solutions, we have the expertise, we know what we're doing. That's what makes us dangerous. If people just join the CEC, that would scare the establishment that's killing them to death.
It already is.
That's the point. That's the number one thing they can do and activate with us. We've run out of time. Thanks for tuning in, and tune in next week for more.